Purposely. Your life, God's purpose. Listen at purposely.com.
This is the AllMomDoes podcast, part of the Purposely Podcast Network, and I am your host, Julie Lyles Carr. I'm so glad you're here today. Thanks for always being part of the AllMomDoes community. We love to come alongside you for the season you're in, the challenges you're tackling, the excitement and different stages that you're having with your family. It's just always such an honor to be in your earbuds or on your car stereo or wherever you're listening. So thanks so much for being with us. You know, we have had several episodes this season where we've been talking about addiction cycles. We've been talking about things that are in our everyday lives that can sometimes command far more of our attention than is probably healthy. And today I'm excited to welcome someone who's going to talk us through what addiction looked like in her marriage with her spouse, how they came to a place where they began to tackle that, how God brought them resources and all kinds of healing. And she's going to have a lot of hope for you and a lot of great wisdom from her experience. So I want to introduce you to Noelle Borgia. Noelle, thank you so much for being with me today.
Thanks for having me on the podcast, Julie. Excited to be here.
Absolutely. Noelle, tell our listener where you live and about your family, all that stuff.
We live in the small town of Romeo, Michigan, and I live with my husband of 10 years and our two daughters, Valentina and Liliana, and they're in the 10th and 12th grade. So one's graduating this year. So we're in that fun season of teenage years right now.
Yeah. What great names. I love your kiddos' names. That's amazing.
Thank you. We're Italian, you know.
Yeah, got to keep it true. I love it. Sounds fantastic. Sounds fantastic. Noelle, take me back in your marriage with Sam, your husband, and take me back to your early romance, how you got to know each other. And then as things progressed through time, how you began to realize that something was up.
Yeah, so it all started back in 2015 or 2014. I was a divorced young mother with the girls were about 5 and 6 years old at the time. And I was living at a condo. I had previously married young and really wasn't quite sure, where a young Christian woman might meet any new fine gentleman. And one day we were just sitting in our condo and we had a surprise knock at our door in the middle of a blizzard. Everybody was snowbound. We couldn't imagine who could possibly be at our door, in the middle of this catastrophic snowstorm that we were going in. And we opened the door. My daughters actually opened the door, and my now husband was standing there. We had never met him before. So, ladies, if you're hoping for a man, he might just show up at your door one day.
You never know, in the middle of a snowstorm. Yep.
The Detroit Lions were playing that day. It was a big day that they had a shot for the playoffs. And as it turned out, he had cooked a bunch of food for a big party he was having. But because of the weather, nobody could come. So he just kind of went around the neighborhood and was knocking on people's doors and inviting them to the festivities. And that's how it began. We went over to the little get together, and very quickly after that, we started the buddings of a romance. Actually, for our first date, we went to church, and I knew that I was much farther along in my walk of faith than he was. I had been a Christian, my entire life. Grew up in the church, and I knew he kind of had a Catholic upbringing, but wasn't really, strong in his faith convictions. But he seemed to have this hunger and desire to know the Lord, just even from the very first knock on my door. Every time we talked about the Lord, every time we went to church, I could see this little sparkle in his eye. He was always telling me that his grandmother had encouraged him to know the Lord. So fast forward over the course of several months, we began a relationship, and unbeknownst to me, we met in January. By March, he had already had a ring made for me.
So he knew.
He proposed in June, and we got married in October. Okay, so it was a 10-month stint, and people probably thought we were crazy. Looking back, it was a little crazy, but you always hear people say, "Oh, when you know." We just had this ease, this beautiful love that developed, and he loved my daughters, and we were quickly starting to put our life together. Now, the only thing that I knew about Sam was that he was in a terrible motorcycle accident when he was in his early 20s. And as a result, they were going to amputate his foot, and they did 5 surgeries to reattach it. And he also broke his back as a result of the accident. So he was kind of laid up in a home hospital bed for a period of a year. And, I noticed some things sometimes when I was over at his condo and helping him clean different things. And he had a lot of prescription drug pills, it seemed like, in the bathroom. And I asked him about them, and one of them was called Suboxone. So I didn't really know. I didn't know anything about addiction. I didn't know anything about opiates, anything like that. I just thought, okay, well, he was in an accident, and they had prescribed him this little drug called Suboxone to help his brain kind of not need the hardcore pain medications. And since it was, many years prior, I think he was 35 when I met him, this was already going to be 12, 13, 14 years in the past. I thought it was a chapter that, had long been closed. So we end up getting married. We bought a beautiful house. Everything seemed to be going pretty good initially. But as soon as we got married, things quickly went rather south. And basically, over the course of our first 2 or 3 years of marriage, I just began to uncover layer after layer of lies, deceit, things he hadn't been honest with me about, and to the point where I was just like, I don't even know the man that I had married. But by that point, we had hitched our lives together. We had a house. I had just, we had our 2 daughters to think about. But it wasn't just the Suboxone that he was on. It turns out that, and as the readers will discover in my book, it was just monumentally and catastrophically worse as the time went on. So at first I thought it was maybe alcohol on top of the Suboxone. Then I thought, well, maybe he's using pain pills because he did have a lot of pain. He was a chef. And then it went on further to find out that he was actively using heroin, crack, and cocaine nearly every day going before and after work. So, we gave so many ultimatums. It just, I can't even tell you the depth and the gravity that the situation became. And that's basically, the course of the whole addiction. And then it ended up with him overdosing in December of 2017. He went to several rehabs, tried to get his life back on track, but the rehabs, and because of the insurance debacle, they didn't really want to pay for a long stint of time. They sent him home, and he just sunk into this vortex of, the depths of blackness that I've never witnessed in any human being before. Basically, what happened was he was trying to kill himself. He couldn't deal with juggling the new life, the marriage. And I think that was kind of the catalyst for everything, was that he had previously been a bachelor for 35 years. And, his issues with drugs, he could, get away with it because he didn't have anybody to be accountable to. But now you throw in 2 children, a house, bills, a wife. It wasn't so easy just to manage it all and balance everything. He couldn't just sneak away. Somebody would notice if he was blown out. You know what I'm saying?
Right.
So that's basically where the story took us. And 3 months after the overdose, I ended up filing for a divorce. But the entire time, I just stood on my faith. I loved him. I didn't know why that I loved him, but I feel like it was just this seed that the Lord planted in my heart to love him. It was almost like I chose to love him. And I just couldn't, I just trusted them in the Lord that he was going to deliver my husband, no matter how horrible the situation looked and how mean and nasty and profane and, all these horrible things that we wrestled with. I just had this faith that he was going to heal my husband. And I stood on his word for all those years. And even as I filed for divorce, with the whole world telling me, you got to run. He's never going to change. Get rid of him. Even my dad told me, if you go back to this guy and let him back in your house, I'm going to disown you. He's not going to change. Get rid of him. So even as I filed for the divorce and had the divorce papers, I couldn't even bring myself to deliver him because I don't know what it was, but I kind of felt like it was like the parable of the lost sheep. Like I was Jesus going in there and just to get that one, God was sending me in there to reveal himself to my husband. And I think it was because of the faith that I saw in my husband, because over the course of our marriage, he got baptized. He continually tried to draw closer to the Lord, but I began to see it as this spiritual warfare attack. It was like every time he made steps to get closer to the Lord, the enemy just wanted to keep him down in that black pit. So that's why I think I really stood by his side. I trusted that the Lord was going to deliver him. But as the time got worse, prolonged, it ended up that he almost died. So it was in March of 2018. I went over to his parents' house where he had moved out after I had filed for the divorce, even though he hadn't been served the papers yet. And I found him in the bed, not breathing, foam coming out of his mouth, gray, sweating. The paramedics came and basically he died. They had to resuscitate him several times, but there was really nothing left of his body. So he was just basically drinking and taking drugs, trying to kill himself by that point because he just couldn't find a way out of the situation. And that's how the enemy works, really. He just wants to destroy you, down to at your lowest state, to you're actually standing in the pit next to him. Mm-hmm. So we begin this stint at the hospital where he has a 5% chance to live. He's in a coma on life support for 9 days, and he just has this barrage of medical issues. Like his heart has given out. He's on dialysis. He has sepsis. He has multi-organ failure. He has no chance of survival. And even after he did wake up from the coma after 9 days, the first words that he said when he woke up from the coma were, "Why didn't you just let me die? I can't even die." So I describe it in the book as he kind of had the hardened heart of the Pharaoh, and no matter what plagues or calamities were thrown at him, each day they would come in, the doctors would round and they would just deliver a new diagnosis. They found out that while he had overdosed, he snapped 2 vertebrae in his spine and he was going to need a rod and cages and all these different things. The dialysis, he was going to be on dialysis for the rest of his life if he made it. And his heart was so hardened and calloused in this perpetual state of bitterness and shame and, all of the destruction that he had caused, the results of his actions over the years. And he just was, I don't even know how to describe it, but it was just like a fortress around his heart. You know what I'm saying? And I just prayed. I every day, even though I had already filed for divorce, I still came to the hospital and his parents were there. And I think they understood, what are you supposed to do? This guy is completely unwilling to change. But at the same time, it just created this dissension between us. And it was in such an uncomfortable position to be in, in that space between spouse, former spouse, the mother-in-laws in the hospital room. But still, I continued to come to the hospital every day, 12 hours a day. And every day when I would drive to the hospital, I would just declare, God's word and pray and put on worship music and just say, Satan, take your hands off my husband. He's a child marked by God. Lord, deliver him in the power of your almighty name every day, round the clock. And for the longest time when I went there, he wouldn't even speak to me. I just sat at the edge of the bed and I would ask myself, why am I doing this? I don't understand. This looks horrible. Everybody's telling me to run and I'm still pursuing this. And I didn't even know why I was pursuing it, but I just still had the faith that the Lord was going to heal him. And actually, today is the day, March 27th, 2018, that I called my husband one morning in the hospital. And something had changed in his voice. And he described this moment for me that basically he just started weeping in his hospital room. And the presence of the Lord filled him and just took away all that callousness and that hardness. And he describes it as, he didn't feel the guilt. He didn't feel the shame. He just felt this overwhelming sense of love come over him. And he said he felt like something was just cut away from him. And it was exactly 7 years today. So I'm glad you have me on the podcast.
Yeah.
It's a big day in our house. And, there's all these countless examples in the Bible of how the Lord can instantly enter somebody's heart and change them in an instant. And it just basically was like a metamorphosis with my husband. You can't explain it any other way because only a supernatural miracle, the divine power of God, could just cut away all that shield and all those walls that he was so bitter. I feel like he put all these walls up around his heart so that he didn't even have to feel anything. You know what I'm saying?
Right.
So the Lord met him, and it was just an instant transformation. I mean, I heard it in his voice. I saw it in his countenance. And it was such a miraculous transformation. I mean, you just have to see it as the power of God. So ever since that day, the Lord took everything away from him. 20 years of heroin, crack, cocaine, opiate abuse, just basically circumcised his heart, just cut it all away. Never had a desire to use or any inkling, any inclination to use drugs again. And that was the end of that. But he was eventually released from the hospital after 16 days. But then we fought another 2.5-year battle because his body was so damaged. So internally and spiritually, everything was made whole. But he was still on dialysis. He still had pancreatic issues, all these legal issues, things like that. So, those are some of the miracles. But the Lord met him, healed him of the dialysis. They told him nobody ever gets off dialysis, but our pastor prayed with him in the church, healed of the dialysis. He ended up having 2.5 years of pancreatic surgeries, ended up losing half of his pancreas. But all the while, through every trial and tribulation he faced with his health, even having to be on, end of road antibiotics when infections set in over the period after he was delivered by the Lord, he never turned back to the drugs. He just, trusted in the Lord. And over the last 7 years, he has just restored everything, not even a double portion, triple, quadruple portion, all the things that we thought were beyond repair. I mean, it's so miraculous. That's why we kind of felt like we have to tell the world about it, because my husband likes to describe it as a treasure. He says, when the Lord gives you a treasure, you don't keep it hidden. You've got to tell everybody about it.
Right.
So that's basically a brief summary of our story. But there's just so many miracles. There was so many things that we thought we could never overcome. I mean, he had warrants out for his arrest. He had felonies on his record. He was on probation. He didn't have a driver's license. We had filed for divorce, which I ripped up the papers. But every single thing we stood on our faith and believed the Lord to bring to fruition has come to pass in his mighty name. And, that's what we want to tell people. That's kind of what our story is what he can do for us. He can, and certainly most will do for you. There's just, it's the good news, the gospel message, and we don't want to keep it hidden.
Right. Noelle, the beginning of this story, I think, is going to be really familiar to a lot of people in terms of so often people can fall into addictive cycles, not because they were wild partiers. I mean, sometimes that's the story, not because necessarily they had a stressor at work and this was a relief, although that can also be part of someone's story. But we're seeing more and more people who end up in really destructive addiction cycles because they were following doctor's orders after a health condition, after an accident, after whatever. And we're seeing some of these things become so difficult because the addiction can get so far because it seems so prescribed. It's not that someone is out just kind of blowing things up in a partying lifestyle. Do you think this was part of Sam's situation, that it took it for him to really realize how deep things had gotten? And I love that you point out that this wonderful thing that happens, this marriage and these two girls that come into his family. And yet it is those moments sometimes, even when good stuff comes along, that all of the plates we've been spinning can come down. We think of a dark moment as when everything's failing, but sometimes good stuff begins to shine light into areas that we didn't necessarily think we wanted there to be light. So for him, was that part of his story, that it just kind of snuck up on him in terms of trying to deal with these injuries from this accident years before?
Well, I think that was the big part of it. He describes how he kind of had he was a little more than rebellious back in his teen years. His family owned restaurants, And he worked from the time he was, a very young child, which, to no fault of his parents, didn't leave much time to parent because, you're just in this world of the whole family works around the clock. I think he may have had a little bit of resentment for that, was a little bit, wilder, driving the motorcycle a little bit recklessly. But then, yes, after that, there was during the 90s, it was the Oxycontin crisis where
Right.
they just rolled out those pills and they didn't give you a way to get off of it. And it just started this cycle that, I don't even think people knew what they were getting into. And certainly I don't think that my husband did. But then there was no easy fix. You know what I'm saying?
Right.
And that's the other thing, too, that I had to learn is that when you're dealing with someone with substance abuse, everything about reason or logic just goes out the window.
It doesn't matter. Yeah.
Because you make all these excuses. Well, my husband loves me. He's not going to do this. We have 2 children. He's not going to take us through this. He just overdosed 3 months ago. Certainly he's going to get his life back on track now. But all that goes out the window. My husband described it as, addiction as basically being the feeling of being underwater. And you're just trying to reach the surface to get one breath. And that's what the drugs become to them, is that it's not a matter of getting high or this life of, living wild and, excitement. It's just trying to survive. It's just depending on the drugs almost for that breath, that gasp of air. And if you don't get it, you see that what people go through, the withdrawals, the sicknesses, things that I never even knew about. And then the world offers other drugs to combat the effects of the initial drugs. So then they throw the Suboxone at you or the methadone. And then even during this whole scenario, we went to psychiatrists. We tried what the world offers. His doctor gave him Xanax because he was having panic attacks. But it's just all these remedies and these quick fixes the world tries to offer, because a lot of times they just want to throw their hands up too. Like, okay, what do we do?
Right.
Yeah. So that's been our experience.
I do think in our faith communities, we have room to grow in conversation in terms of these prescription cycles. I think we've done a pretty good job talking about things like alcohol, illegal drugs, things like that. We hear a lot of conversation about that in faith communities and the risks there. But I don't know that we're as well educated or empathetic or as understanding about what happens when it comes to prescription medications. And certainly that's a place where we really owe it to our fellow believers, our brothers and sisters in Christ, to do a better job educating ourselves, which is one of the reasons I was excited to have you on the show. Noelle, how did you as a spouse, now that you've seen this, you realize how deep, because let's face it, with any addiction cycle, there is so much deceit that goes on in order to support those behaviors. So you've come through all this, you've come kind of to the edge of the marriage anyway with your family going, why are you still in this? You stay, you see an incredible redemption story, but now you are in the wash of what remains, which is the consequence. I think a lot of times when we think about or talk about God changing someone's heart, something turning around very quickly,
Yes.
God can remove some of those consequences, but sometimes we still have to walk out the consequences of what happened. So how did you, as a wife now really re-entering this marriage in heart and in practice, begin to work with that very interesting dual combination of both trust and accountability? Because Noelle, sometimes I hear people that, well, if you really trusted me, you wouldn't put accountability measures in place.
Right.
Or, you hear kind of that dynamic, that tension. So what was that part of the journey like for y'all as you moved beyond the addiction, but you were dealing with all the fallout?
Well, it actually took me longer, much longer for spiritual healing than my husband. Okay, he was healed. He met the Lord and he was just living in the joy of Jesus, even through all of our trials. For me, however, I saw the transformation before my very eyes, but because we had lived in this world of upheavals and chaos and turmoil for all these years, I just got accustomed to it. I just expected the next bomb to drop. And I continually looked for it and watched for it. And I kind of talk about it in the book, how I felt like I was sitting on the watchtower of my life, just looking, is any contraband sneaking in? Are there any escapees that can't be accounted for this evening? And I lived for many years after he was delivered in this state of fear. It kept me paralyzed a lot of times. I saw with my eyes, like I said, that he had been transformed, and I trusted in the Lord, but I still couldn't shake this fear that held me captive that, well, he's clean now. Look how far he's come. He's not going to go back. But those are all the things I told myself prior to the Lord delivering.
Right.
You know what I'm saying? So it wasn't until several years ago, they offered this program at our church. It was a 2-year school of ministry program. And this is actually the catalyst for the book as well. And I always wanted to just go deeper in my faith. And I signed up for the class. I said, okay, I'm going to go to the 2-year ministry school program. And one of the first classes, which I couldn't figure out why it was first at the time, because I said, well, don't we have to get into the Old Testament, the New Testament? We've got a lot of work to do, spiritual formation, and you want us to read this book. And it was a book called The Bait of Satan by John Bevere. I'm not sure if you've ever read it before.
Yeah.
And when we read this book, I really went through a transformation process. And that was the first time that I felt like, that fear was holding me captive. It was holding my heart hostage, and it was preventing me from stepping into my purpose for the Lord. And all the offenses, I said I forgave him of them, but I still remembered them. I still couldn't let go of them, So I read that book, and we had to write a little 3-page testimony. And I wrote kind of the 3-page abridged version of the book that I just wrote, and I shared it with the class, and we'd been sharing our testimony all along. And we were just so blown away by people's response to what the Lord had done in our lives. And that was basically the catalyst. As soon as I wrote the paper, the Lord was like, you got to write the book. You got to write the book. So actually, the book was part of my healing. The Lord took that fear away. And as soon as he did, it launched me into this season where, okay, now I can do his work. I can share the message. Because prior to that, we had this good news, but it was always kind of overshadowed by this fear that kept me captive.
Right.
So that was the gist of that situation. But now we're on the other side of it, and we just have a peace that has washed over our lives. So we don't live in that season anymore.
Right. Noelle, what do you say to someone who says, wow, I have a spouse who went through addiction cycle, and our story turned out a different way. The marriage needed to end. They're still struggling, the impact that it's had on our kids, et cetera. How does someone go to rebuild from that perspective when maybe they don't get the same result at the end? Maybe someone is still in that world and they have to make a decision to move forward and walk with God in a different way.
Yeah, I feel like the Lord has a different path for each of us, and he's going to make that plan revealed to you no matter what you choose. I had been divorced before, and I personally felt a lot of shame about that. I was a Christian, we're Italian. Nobody gets divorced in our family. I carried that even into this season, loving my husband and standing by his side. And thinking, well, what are people going to say? You didn't stand behind your first husband's side. This is going to, how are you going to say that you stood by your now husband's side? So I wrestled with that a lot, but I just realized that it's the enemy trying to prevent you by showing you that you're not equipped. So he'll play on those different things. But when the Lord has something planned for your life, I think you'll know it in your spirit. If you're meant to stay, I didn't want to stay with my husband.
Yeah.
I wanted to leave him, but the Lord just wrote it on my heart, and he reminded me every single day. So I think that the Lord will speak through his word. If you're in the word daily, he's going to speak to it with his rhema, the Holy Spirit that's going to come alive to you in the words of those scriptures. And you will have the revelation of, should I stay, Lord? Should I go? And, there's the saying, choose your heart. No, one way or the other is not often the easier route. You just have to be in communion with the Lord, and he's going to lay out the right path for you.
Right. That's such a powerful piece of wisdom from somebody who's been there and who can also see that sometimes the Lord writes a different story and he is still right there in the midst of it
He's
when he
still the
does.
author.
Right, right. We have a beautiful new book out called Silence the Lion. You liken your experience to Daniel in the Lion's Den. Where can the listener go to find your book?
We have a website called www.shatteredmirrorministries.com that has links to all the places you can buy it, but just anywhere books are sold: Amazon, Barnes & Noble's, ChristianBook.com, Books A Million, and it's launching on April 15th.
Congratulations to you. And are you on the socials? Is there a place where listeners can go to see you on the social media platforms?
Yes, on Facebook at Silence the Lion and Instagram as well. I just started rolling out the Instagram. They told me I had to do all this. I'm not much of a social media person, but we've been getting used to it. And there's some videos and testimonies that we've shared on there. So I think the listener will be really encouraged.
Okay, awesome. Thank you so much. And Noelle, I just so appreciate your openness, your heart to just talk about what your experience has been, the wisdom that you have gained. I really appreciate your time today. Thanks so much.
Thank you for having me, Julie. I appreciate you.
Absolutely.
God bless you all.
You too. All right, listener, you know what to do. Show notes. That's what Rebecca puts together for us. It's going to have all of the links that Noelle talked about. We love for you to come over to allmomdoes.com and AllMomDoes on the socials as well, because that's a fantastic community for women who are in the same seasons of life that you're in, with all kinds of heart and resources and ideas for you to be sure and check that out. I love to hear from you over on Instagram. I'm Julie Lyles Carr over there, and I love it when you come in my DMs and let me know the things that you're grappling with, the questions you have, different things that are making an impact, a guest that you would like to see on the show. That is so helpful to us. Hey, please grab a link from this episode and send it to someone who you know would benefit from listening and hearing about this encouraging story from Noelle. That is one of the best thank yous you can give us. And I will see you next time on the All Mom Does podcast.
Thanks for listening. We just wanted to take a minute to let you know that just like you and your family, Purposely is also part of a family, the Krista family of ministries. Krista helps kids and teens learn and grow in their faith at King Schools and Miracle Ranch Camp. And Krista shares Jesus with people in the poorest, most remote places through World Concern. Krista Senior Living is a community of love and care, and Krista Media is a place of hope on the radio. God is changing lives through these 5 ministries, and Krista is on mission to share the good news of Jesus. To learn more, visit Krista.org.